Look at these 3 words written larger than the rest, with a special pride never written before or since. Tall words proudly saying, "We the people."
Hi folks, and welcome to a presentation from the Lex Rex Institute. I'm Alexander Haberbush, President and Lead Counsel here at the Lex Rex Institute, where we keep the government in check and remind officials that the Constitution isn't just a suggestion. Now, today we're going to be talking about something that trips up a lot of voters, and that's how to vote for judges. We tend not to know who these candidates are. We tend not to know how the different offices for judges differ. How do we vote for these folks? Who can we trust when voting for a judge? And how do you know who these candidates are, evaluate them, and make an informed decision at the polls? Well, we're going to answer that today. And specifically, we'll tell you how to pick good judges. Before we start off, it's important to note that while most states elect judges, a couple don't. I think the only ones that don't are Hawaii and New Jersey. Those are the only states that elect no judges at all. Hawaii, I know, uses a judicial nominating commission, while New Jersey's judges are appointed by the governor and then confirmed by the state senate. But I believe that for every other state, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe every other state elects at least some of its judges. So those are the states that we're concerned with today. The ones that elect judges, those are the ones that you're going to be voting for. So in states that do elect judges, there are 2 different kinds of races you can have. You can have partisan races and nonpartisan races. And all the partisan race means is that the candidate's political party is listed on the ballot. So you can vote for the Republican judge or the Democrat judge. States like Texas and Alabama have partisan judicial elections. I believe more states have nonpartisan ones. My home state of California has nonpartisan races. Now, it may seem like it's a lot easier to vote in a partisan judicial election, and in some ways it is, but we caution you against voting party. You always want to know who these candidates are. The mere fact that someone's from a particular party doesn't necessarily mean they're a good candidate. Their party may mean they're a bad candidate. But you still want to know who these individuals are before you vote. So we're going to assume we're looking at nonpartisan judicial races today, both because I think the same principles apply as in partisan races, since we should always be looking at individual candidates, and because I live in California, which happens to have nonpartisan races, so it makes it easier for me. Now, when electing someone to any office, the very first and absolutely most important thing that you want to know is what the job actually entails. You don't just want to vote for the nicest person or the most charismatic person. You want to vote for the one who will do the best at the job. Now, you probably wouldn't hire the funniest guy at a party to do your taxes, but you're also not looking for the best person. You're looking for the best judge. Being a judge is a specific job, and it has specific skills and qualifications that should and must go with it. The same way you wouldn't want to hire the nicest guy in the room to perform a surgery if that guy's not a surgeon, you also wouldn't want to hire the person whose politics or goals happen to align most closely with yours just because that person has those politics. And that's because the consequences of having bad judges is just as, if not even more dire than having a bad surgeon. A bad surgeon can botch a procedure, and that's, of course, tragic for the patient involved. But a bad judge, well, they can botch the entire course of justice, not just for one person, but for communities, nations, even generations. Judges have an incredible amount of power in our system, and they can use that power to shape lives with their decisions. When they don't understand certain types of law, or worse, when they're not impartial, that can have far-reaching and dire consequences. For example, in around 450 BC in ancient Rome, yes, I know, bear with me, our law is very old, Appius Claudius, one of the decemviri, abused his power when he sat both as his own judge and litigant in the same trial when trying to enslave the free Roman girl Virginia through a biased ruling driven by his own personal lust. Now, this corrupt act so outraged the people that it led to a revolt that collapsed the decemvirate and marked the end of their rule. Claudius's abuse of the judicial power didn't just cause an injustice, it actually triggered the downfall of Rome's entire governing system at the time. During Stalin's purges, Andrei Wyszynski presided over and prosecuted the infamous show trials, where he obtained forced confessions, often indicting his suspects before investigations had even concluded. His extreme political bias led to him condemning thousands to execution or labor camps, usually on fabricated charges of treason or espionage. After the failed Monmouth Rebellion in England in the mid to late 1680s, Judge George Jeffreys and others let their political bias in favor of King James II lead them to issue harsh sentences against rebels. Hundreds were executed, and many more were transported to the colonies as slaves under rushed and unfair trials. Now, there's actually a great movie about this starring Errol Flynn called Captain Blood in the 1930s. And this was about somebody who was convicted in exactly this way during this period. And, of course, he became a pirate in that movie, which is awesome, but probably not a desirable judicial outcome. In more recent years, in 2007, based on nothing more than a state court judge's decision, California lost access to about 30% of its water supply, when a court ruled that the Sacramento Delta smelt apparently had a better claim to that water. Same way courts have often stymied housing developments under CEQA and blocked pension reforms in Illinois. Now that we know that the consequences of a bad judge are dire, how do we detect which candidates will be bad judges? And how do we prevent them from getting on the bench? Well, most of them probably aren't going to go around shouting at their opponents or terrorist thugs and degenerates or accursed vermin or mad dogs of the bourgeoisie like Wyszynski did. And they're probably not going to sit as judges in their own trials like Claudius did, but they might be just as biased as those individuals, and they may be just as unqualified. So how do we know? Well, let's look at that first and most important question again. What does a judge actually do? We've touched on this, but it's important to break down, especially since different judges handle different types of cases, depending on their jurisdiction. First off, it's important to note the distinction between federal and state judges. Federal judges handle a variety of cases involving federal law, the Constitution, or disputes between citizens of different states. But here's the good news. You don't vote for federal judges, any of them. They're all appointed, so you can focus solely on state-level judges, as those will be the only ones that you're actually voting for in your local elections. Good, one thing down. So for the rest of this video, we'll be focusing on state court judges, because those are the ones you'll be voting for in your local elections. Now, within the state court system, judges' roles can also vary, depending on where you live. In some jurisdictions, all judges are generalists. They'll handle a wide range of cases, including criminal, civil, family law, and more. But in larger counties or states, and I think this is probably the more common option, their roles are often specialized. So you might have a family court judge who deals only with custody and divorce cases, or a probate judge who only handles wills and estates, or a criminal court judge who focuses solely on felonies and misdemeanors. Typically, civil and criminal courts are presided over by the same judge, who will rule on all those things, while probate and family courts tend to be separated out. But you're going to want to look at what kind of cases the judge that you're voting for is going to handle in your jurisdiction. That's important to know before casting your vote. So how do you learn this? Well, research is going to be key here. Look up the court that they're running for. Find out what types of cases they'll handle. Your local election guide or your county website would be a good place to start. And they'll tell you what division or court that judge would be presiding over. You don't want to vote for a candidate thinking they'll be handling criminal cases when they'll actually be deciding wills and trusts or family law disputes. Those are very different, and needless to say, you'll vote for the judge very differently based on the duties that judge will have. So, what sort of duties does a judge have? Well, it's obviously, like I said, going to vary based on their specific role, but broadly speaking, we can say that judges' day-to-day duties involve a lot more than what you see in TV dramas. They'll oversee trials and hearings. They'll ensure that legal procedures are properly followed. They interpret and apply the law. They make decisions based on legal precedent and the facts presented in each case. If there's a jury involved, they'll guide the jurors on how to apply the law. And when there's no jury, the judge actually makes the final determination of fact as well. Now, in criminal cases, judges also decide sentencing after conviction, determining appropriate punishment based on the case details and legal guidelines. Outside the courtroom, judges manage court staff, write opinions, review legal motions, and handle a variety of administrative tasks. So how does any of that inform your vote? Well, first of all, consider whether or not the candidate that's running has relevant legal experience. So a judge handling family law should have experience in that area. Same way that a criminal court judge would be someone you want to have experience in probably rules of evidence, probably criminal law, things of that nature. You also want someone who can manage a courtroom effectively. That's true for any position as a judge. Someone who can remain calm under pressure, and someone who can always remain impartial, even when very controversial subjects are presented to him. Judicial temperament is absolutely key. Look for someone who demonstrates fairness, patience, and the ability to handle complex legal issues without bias. Finally, Remember that a judge's decision doesn't just affect the case in front of him. It sets precedent for what can impact future cases and the legal system in your community. So how do you know any of these things when you've never heard any of the names on your ballot before? How can we know who has a good judicial temperament? How can we know who has the relevant background and experience? Well, to determine that, I'm going to start with some ways not to vote for a judge, because that's the real challenge. If we can eliminate some of the, I think, mistaken ways to vote for a judge, we should make this task a lot easier for us. Firstly, don't rely on the American Bar Association's recommendations or your state bar's ratings. The American Bar Association, or ABA, and a lot of state bars too, will conveniently rate judicial candidates as well qualified, qualified, and not qualified. Convenient, right? It sounds like an objective, neutral evaluation of a judge's competence. But here's the thing. The ABA is anything but neutral. They have a history of leaning toward progressive, often very far-left positions on legal issues, and this bias influences how they assess judicial candidates. So a candidate who champions limited government enshrined in our Constitution, the individual liberties central to our legal system, and the judicial restraint proper to the role of the judiciary will consistently be rated lower by the ABA, even if they are perfectly competent and experienced. Likewise, judges who share the ABA's ideological leanings are often given a well-qualified rating, regardless of their judicial temperament or actual qualifications. So when the ABA rates a candidate as not qualified or well qualified, all that should really tell you is whether or not that candidate's views and preferences align with the ABA's. Now, the same is true, in fact, I would say it's more true even of state bar organizations who tend to be a good deal more partisan still. Look no further than what happened with Dr. John Eastman to see just how biased these groups can be and just how politically motivated their outcomes are. So, take their endorsements with a grain of salt, or I would say even a full shaker of salt. Perhaps surprisingly, the political bias of state bar organizations tends not to match and often doesn't match the political makeup of the state overall. That's because state bar organizations, and the ABA too, are not actually government entities. While they often enjoy special privileges from government, they're private entities that have their own goals and agendas that are independent of that state's politics. So you may live in a very conservative state, and it may still have a very liberal state bar. Don't assume just because you have a state that agrees with you that your state bar is going to be better than it would otherwise be. You're still going to want to look into that, and it's still going to be a very biased organization. We don't recommend taking their advice at all. The second mistake is thinking that prosecutors automatically make the best judges. For some reason, people tend to think that prosecutors are very well qualified for the bench. I'm not really sure why this is, but as a result of this, a huge number, I'd say likely even a majority, of sitting state court judges come from prosecutorial backgrounds. But the problem here is twofold. Firstly, it creates a very narrow perspective on the bench, and that's really not a good thing. But secondly, it's actually not necessarily going to select for the best qualified candidates. See, prosecutors spend most of their career trying to get evidence admitted into court, while the defense tries to block that evidence. It's because prosecutors are trying to get people convicted, so they want evidence in so it can result in a conviction for their cases. Now, this focus on admitting evidence tends to make them pretty lax about enforcing strict rules of evidence once they actually do become judges, because they're so used to having all of their evidence denied, and it annoys them, so they end up not doing the same thing once they're on the bench. But the problem here is the rules of evidence are a cornerstone of fairness in our legal system, and they ensure that only reliable and lawful evidence is used. The problem also is that even if you may want some of this evidence admitted for our very worst criminals, these judges, if they sit both in a criminal and civil context, which is true of most judges, will do this same thing in civil cases, where we definitely don't want this kind of laxness with respect to evidence. Now, while it might be nice for organizations like the Lex Rex Institute to get a little bit more lax of a time on getting evidence admitted, especially in our election law cases where it tends to be notoriously difficult to get evidence admitted, this is not a good thing in the overall scope. Because these rules of evidence are considered a hallmark of Anglo-Americans' rights and liberties, and they've been considered that for over a millennium. They're central to the rule of law, and it's a huge problem if judges are lax with these rules. So, all that to say, probably don't want to vote for a prosecutor because of that issue alone. Additionally, criminal cases, while obviously very important to our system, tend to be very simple and pretty straightforward from a legal standpoint. They involve clear laws, straightforward procedures, predictable outcomes. Now that's exactly what you want when crimes are concerned, because we don't want people prosecuted for laws that they didn't understand, right? The Founding Fathers used to say that the criminal law should be simple enough to be understood by an average man while running. And that's good. We want that for crimes. But a prosecutor turned judge might be great at handling those sort of cases, but they may struggle when it comes to complex civil or constitutional cases, which involve more nuanced legal questions and broader implications for individual rights. Now, LRI has actually seen this firsthand with some judges from prosecutorial backgrounds who just aren't equipped to handle these more intricate issues. They weren't biased judges per se, and they weren't malicious. They just didn't have the legal experience needed to grasp the complex legal arguments that we were bringing, which were outside of their prosecutorial background. Now, a better thing to look at is the candidate's experience. So how long has that person been a lawyer? What kind of law did they practice while they were a lawyer? That's why, as constitutional lawyers, LRI's unbiased opinion is that you should vote for constitutional lawyers. But in all seriousness, variety matters. You want a judge who's seen a wide range of cases. That diversity of experience is key to handling the full spectrum of issues that can and will come before most judges. Also, remember that candidates get to choose their own ballot designations. The ballot designation is the little blurb that says what that person's job is. So don't take those designations at face value. For example, somebody might call themselves a civil rights attorney, but when you dig deeper, you find out that they've mostly been handling personal injury cases. Now ask yourself why they chose that label. What are they trying to highlight, or what are they trying to obscure? Now, I've seen strange ones on ballots from time to time. In fact, just fairly recently on a ballot, I saw a candidate who labeled himself as an LGBTQ prosecutor. Now, that's not a thing at all. In fact, if it were, it would mean they prosecute people for being LGBTQ, like a homicide prosecutor prosecutes homicides. So clearly that candidate wasn't putting their actual profession, they were just trying to virtue signal by including something about themselves in their ballot designation instead of highlighting relevant legal experience. Now, I won't tell you whether or not I voted for that person, but based on my advice, I think you could probably guess. Now, some of these ballot designation issues might seem pretty obvious, but they can get a lot more subtle than this too. For example, if someone just lists attorney with no specifics, it could mean they want to avoid highlighting the actual type of law they practice. Maybe they handle minor transactional work or unlawful detainers, but they don't want that to define them in the election. But it could just mean that they're succinct. A lot of people don't like to have too much detail in a ballot designation, and that's fine. On the other hand, if someone labels themselves a business litigator, that tells you they deal primarily with corporate disputes, which again is very different from criminal or family law. Next, it's good to check if a candidate has been disciplined by their state bar, but be careful here. We don't want to treat all disciplinary actions the same way. And sometimes lawyers are disciplined for taking principled stances. Remember, we mentioned earlier how those state bar organizations can be pretty biased. So a lawyer might be disciplined for something like a public defender who's pushed back against harsh injustices, may be disciplined, and that may show up on their state bar profile. So just because someone has been disciplined doesn't mean that they're not a strong advocate for justice. You're going to want to look deeper into the reasons behind that discipline. And you can find pretty much all discipline on a state bar's website. It'll tell you whether that lawyer has been disciplined, and it'll tell you why they were disciplined. But you're going to want to actually read that, especially because things that aren't actually discipline show up there. Like if someone's been indicted for a crime, that shows up on the state bar profile. And it'll say like this, an indictment is not evidence of guilt, but it's got this huge red text. It looks very scary. So don't just look at the text. You're going to want to read it and see what's actually happened with that person and whether or not that's something that should affect your vote. So now let's say you want to dig deeper into a candidate's practice background, and I think that is something that's desirable to do if you have the time to do it. There are several ways to find out what kind of law a person actually has been practicing. The first thing you can do is look at their campaign website. But again, I want to be careful here too, because we don't expect to find anything substantive on the website. This isn't an objective, fact-based thing. These are made by the candidates. They're made with the candidates' clear agendas in mind, and that's their goal, is to get that person elected. So you should look at these as marketing material and nothing more. But what does marketing material show you? Well, it can show you somebody's priorities, and it's often important to know what a person's priorities are prior to deciding whether or not to vote for them. But at the end of the day, it is marketing material, and you should treat it as such. We've already mentioned the state bar profile. Most bar associations will have an online database with an attorney's state bar profile. That'll tell you what kind of law that attorney practices. It'll also provide you details about their career history. And that's where you can see if they have any disciplinary action that's been taken against them. But again, be careful with this, as we discussed earlier. Next, you can search for that attorney's case history. If the candidate has worked on any prominent cases, you might be able to find information through online legal databases, court websites, or even news articles. This will give you an insight into the kinds of cases they've handled and whether or not they've performed well and just generally what their practice background is like. You can look for review websites like Martindale-Hubbell or AVO, which provide peer reviews of lawyers, and sometimes you can find client reviews too. Now, again, a lot of times on AVO, those reviews are lawyers will ask their friends or their colleagues for reviews, so they don't necessarily show you how well qualified that lawyer is either. But at least it'll show you whether or not they're liked in their community. You can find somebody else to review them. A lot of times client reviews might not be great either, because you'll have ones that, like a debt collection lawyer, is going to have really negative reviews from the public because people that had their debts collected by that lawyer aren't going to like them. So again, you can't just look at a star rating. You're going to want to read those reviews and see what they actually say. Another thing you can do is research public appearances. Sometimes candidates have spoken at legal seminars, published articles, or appeared on panels. And a quick search of their name alongside legal terms can pull up articles or recordings that show you their expertise and public stances on various issues. I know that LexRex has a few of those, so if we run, you could just look up our YouTube channel that you're watching right now. Fortunately, nobody from LexRex is running currently, because as I've said before, nobody in the LexRex Institute has ever worked in government, except for Deborah, who worked with the Air Force, but we'll forgive her that one. I think that's a bit different. Now, Google is your friend. A simple Google search with the attorney's name plus relevant terms like cases, practice area, or court rulings can often bring up useful information from various sources, including local news outlets and legal blogs that have reported on their work. On the flip side, try not to overly rely on social media. The person who's the best at standing out online is rarely the best candidate for a judge. Judges have to be cool-headed and sober in temperament. So you don't want someone who's flashy or flamboyant. That's a huge red flag. So judges need to be impartial, calm, and consistent. And those who make the loudest noise on social media tend not to be the best fit for the bench for exactly those reasons. Unless, of course, they have informative videos on the legal intricacies of Star Wars Andor and Harry Potter. When choosing someone to wield the kind of power that judges have in our system, which is often unparalleled, you really want to pick someone who is kind of boring. Their role doesn't demand charisma or political loyalty, but impartiality, restraint, and a deep understanding of the law. The decision to elect a boring candidate, the one who quietly and diligently works to apply the law as it is, becomes not just reasonable, but necessary. Now, lastly, it's also a good idea to talk to a friend who might know more than you do. Maybe they work in the legal profession, or maybe they just tend to be better informed on certain issues. But don't just vote the way that they do. Ask them why they prefer a particular candidate and compare the reasons they give you against what you've learned from this video. That way, you can make a decision that truly reflects your own understanding and values. Now, lastly, I want to talk about endorsements. Endorsements can also be tricky. Now, where I'm from, if a candidate is endorsed by the local newspaper, it probably means they're a communist. And endorsements from a group like the Firefighters Association or Police Officers Association, while they may sound good, are actually endorsements from public employees' unions. Endorsements from these groups can often mean that those candidates are overly cozy with public unions, which strongly suggests that they're not going to be an independent or impartial judge and not going to be somebody that you want on the bench. So in short, electing a judge requires more than just looking at a resume or checking a few boxes. You need to research, evaluate, and think critically about their background, qualifications, and demeanor. Don't just go for the name that sounds familiar or the person with the flashiest campaign. Go for the one who has the qualities of a good judge: fairness, experience, and level-headedness. In the end, a judge's role isn't to entertain or to be popular, although it may make my hearings a lot more tolerable when they are. It's to ensure that the justice is done without fear, favor, or prejudice. Electing the wrong judge can lead to consequences far worse than we can predict. The best choice, therefore, isn't the one who agrees with us on every political point, but the one who can be trusted to interpret the law fairly and consistently day after day. And with that, we wrap up this episode of our local election series on judges. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, an informed vote is the best vote. And when in doubt, vote against the incumbent. Unless you're certain they're doing a good job, they're probably not. And as always, the deep state must be destroyed.